I was a sophomore in college the first time I read the book, and that was, a reading requirement when I took a photography class in the art department, which is really appropriate, right? Because he's talking about the connections between art and technology, which is pretty much what photography is. And I have to say, I didn't understand the book, and my conclusion after reading it was that Robert Pirsig just was crazy, that what he was saying couldn't be true. But slowly I began to understand what he was saying. It probably took me 20 years to really figure out what he was doing. I met Robert Pirsig in Liverpool in 2005. The occasion was Anthony McWatt's PhD was finally finished. And it was the world's first PhD in Robert Pirsig's philosophy. So it was kind of a graduation party that turned into an amateur philosophy conference. Nobody there had a PhD in philosophy. It was kind of funny that way. But I met him that weekend and was blown away. You know, you get to have a beer with your favorite hero. It was like a dream come true. And I saw him the next day, and then the next day after that. And he said some very encouraging things. And by the time it was over, I had his email address, and I could ask him to write me a letter of recommendation. I went back to grad school to study his work. Robert Pirsig's take on value rigidity is basically about, well, it's just like you'd think, being open-minded, to be spontaneous, to take what comes, to be open to new ideas. That's where creativity is going to come from. I like to joke that incompetence is the mother of originality. And you kind of don't know what you're doing. You kind of have to figure it out on your own. You've sort of reached the limit of what other people have to say about something. At a certain point, you just got to go off on your own. Gumption traps, well, that was a homespun way for Robert Pirsig to talk about all the ego hang-ups that prevent us from seeing the task at hand clearly. You get frustrated and your ego gets involved. Why can't I do this? And it's not going fast enough, and those sort of things. So towards the end of Zen and the Art, Robert Pirsig gets into sort of where's the origin of this problem that he's discussing? Where does this come from? And he sort of traces it back to the time of the ancients, particularly Plato. And his main complaint is that Plato was almost there. He was talking about the good. He was talking about quality in Robert Pirsig's sense of being the good. But he turned it into a fixed and rigid idea, an eternally existing idea that somehow manifests itself in the world of space and time. So that everything in the real world is kind of just a copy of this real thing that we don't even really have access to. So William James, very much like Robert Pirsig, he calls this vicious intellectualism or vicious abstractionism. And the main problem there is you're believing in your abstractions too much at the expense of the flux of reality, as the phenomenal reality that we actually live in every day somehow becomes less real than these ideals and these abstractions. And that this is what's been wrong with philosophy for a couple dozen centuries. There are two main opponents to metaphysics, Pirsig says, positivists and mystics. Basically, the positivists reject metaphysics because they think it's meaningless nonsense. You can't really, it's unscientific. There's no way to test it or anything like that. And the mystic will tell you that you just can't, because you're thinking. You have to stop thinking. Metaphysics is just a tangle of lots of static concepts and abstractions all, trying to be coordinated to get at the truth. The truth is really pre-verbal, pre-intellectual, pre-conceptual. It's before you start chopping the world up with your mind, it's already whole. It's already undivided. You don't have to realize some great union, some great unity. Just stop thinking, and it was always there before you started chopping it up. Science is a child of philosophy, right? It's empiricism and a practical program in the real world, but it's basically philosophical empiricism. And then at the very heights, at the top of the story or the climax, somewhere around Bozeman, he's camping way up at the top of a mountain with his son. Then he gets into the spiritual stuff. So he's taking it in layers: technology, science, philosophy, mysticism, and he's trying to show how all of these things are connected, how it's our philosophical ideas that translate down into the science, that translate down into the technology. And so the way to fix the technological problems is to fix it at the philosophical level. I've come to think that the book is very important, way more important than I have initially realized. Because if you hear what he's saying that reality is a lot more plastic and malleable than we think it is, that we have a lot more freedom than we think we do. You know, you kind of have to, at one point he says something like, you have to either resign yourself to the system or reject it altogether and, you know, step outside of society. But this way of thinking offers you freedom within the world.